Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Claudia Rizzini. I am the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. Today's speaker is Dr. Hong Yang, the Charles J. Smiley Professor of Geobiology at Bryant University. Hong has described his research as being at the intersection of geology, biology, and climatology, ranging from molecules to the global climate system. He has worked on material collected across our planet from the tropical forest to the Arctic Circle, analyzing all biological and geological data to help better understand our new problem, the causes, rate, and impact of climate change. Hong's scientific contributions are in the fields of organic and isotope geochemistry and paleobotany, with the goal to addressing larger climate questions. He played a major role in determining the evolutionary history of the endangered metasequoia, also known as dawn redwood. The metasequoia was thought to have existed only in the fossil record until 1944, when living specimens were discovered in a remote valley of southern China. With his colleagues, he recently reconstructed ancient carbon dioxide level concentration from the 15-million-year-old Clarkia Lake deposit in northern Idaho. This data will help better model the rate and impact of future climate change. In addition to focusing on the Earth climate, Hong also has his eyes on Mars, anxiously waiting to study sediment samples collected from the red planet. Hong is also passionate about climate change education and science communication. During his year at Radcliffe, he plans to use the data he generated through his research and the input of other fellows to establish experiential learning programs for college students. Hong went to college in China to study geobiology with the intent to find more fossil fuels, but he ended up in the United States in search for ways to reduce them. As Bryant University inaugural Vice President for International Affairs, he used to travel around the world to forge collaborations. He sees himself as a bridge builder among different academic disciplines, between cultures, and among people from different nations. I'm so happy to give the floor to our William and Flora Hewlett Foundation Fellow, Hong Yang.
Well, thank you so much, Claudia, for the very generous introduction. As she introduced all other fellows, she used exactly 2.5 minutes. So she did a good job today. But I will show you, in this short time, 2.5 minutes, about 3 million tons of glaciers has been melted. And I'm a swimmer, so I know there's a lot of waters can fill in about 1,500 swimming pool. That's Olympic size. At the same time, about 150,000 coral reefs has died in the tropical areas. I can also say that by the end of my talk, so about 5 species on Earth will go to extinct. And talk about money, 2.5 minutes. Climate change-induced costs that will cost you about $2 million, and that's US only alone. So all this was because we put too much carbon in there. So if this number, 500,000 metric tons for 2.5 minutes, does not make much sense, you can think about this. This heat trapped will be equivalent of 2,500 of Hiroshima atomic bombs. Now, this is minutes after minutes, hour after hour, and day after day. So that is the problem. So in my talk, I will utilize some of our research as examples to talk about carbon in the air, particularly the carbon dioxide, the past, the present, and the future. We're going to do a time travel back to the Miocene time. So Miocene is a geological time. that spans somewhere around 23 million years to 5 million years of time. And also we're going to read the so-called geological fine prints. So I borrowed this term from a legal term in a good way. So basically we're looking at these fine details of the geological record and to see how much of this can help us to address future climate change. So the science of climate change actually, particularly regarding the greenhouse gas, is not that complicated. Put in a simple term, that we receive solar radiation, and much of the heat get absorbed on the land and also much in the water, and some get reflected back. And because we have these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, CO2 mainly, and also methane, CH4, and other greenhouse gases, minors. It's because of the gas in the air, it traps the heat. So that, because of this, we're cooked on Earth. So because of this trapping heat, the Earth has an energy imbalance. In a simple way, that more radiation coming to the sun, less going out. All right. So in fact, in the past 150 years or so, since the Industrial Revolution, the CO2 level in the air has been increasing. It started, well, if you look at the pre-industrial time, somewhere around 270. And today, if each one of you inhale a breath of air, about 420 ppm will be CO2. It sounds like a small amount. But actually, it does a lot of job trying to, to trap the heat. And also, I want you to see around the blue lines are the temperature changes, the white colors. So it does not take a genius to see the temperature and the CO2 are tightly correlated. So put it into a geological term. This looks like a busy diagram, but I prepared this for another presentation by synthesizing data available right now. So you can see it, the part A is the geological past. So the part A, obviously we could not measure the CO2 level in the past. So we learned this by using indirect ways known as the praxis. So as you can see, the blue lines here, or the black lines, are the changes of CO2 in the past, in the time of millions of years. It goes back to 100 million years in part A. So the part B here is measured CO2 in about 70 years of measurement. I believe Karen showed this same diagram known as the Keating curve. Important information should be repeated again. But I want you to pay attention for the numbers there in the enlarged portion. So 70 years ago happened to be the time when alma mater, China University of Geosciences, got established. So at the time, the CO2 was only 315. So when I got to America toward the end of 1980s, it got up to 350. Now today, again, is 420. So the number is important because I will come back why the Clarkia research is important for this. So the C part is the future. Obviously, those are model data. How good is the model depends upon our understanding of the present and then the past CO2. So one of the ways of looking at this, those different lines represent a different social economic pathways defined by the IPCC or the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. But I want you to see this horizontal origin dashed line. So that is the amount of CO2 being doubled. So in climate science, it's very important to understand when you double the CO2 amount, how much temperature is going to increase. So that's known as the equilibrium climate sensitivity. So the next time when we see the CO2 getting doubled from the pre-industrial time, 270, is somewhere around more than 500 ppm. So we have to find this back in the geological time because the climate change we are dealing with is so unprecedented. There's no time in the historical time we can find this information. So we have to go back to Miocene. That was a time when the CO2 was about double of the pre-industrial amount. I like this quote here. Pearl Buck said, in order to face the future, we have to face the past. This can also be said in the planetary scale. So it turns out a window of the past is in Idaho. So when you look at this massed black colored rocks, okay, when you travel to the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, you'll see this. Actually, the indigenous people have been living on this land for thousands of years. And about 200 years ago, when Lewis and Clark traveling to this land, and they recognized this actually in William Clark's diary. He said, black rocks are everywhere. So those rocks are known as the Columbia River basalt that was erupted sometimes during the middle part of Miocene, as I showed here in the chart. So as you see, those rocks are different flows, different layers. So each flow is one episode of basalt eruption. There was about 100 of them. So the Columbia River basalt actually is one of the largest basalt eruptions during the Earth's history. It happened to be the latest and the most well-studied. So what Lewis and Clark did not notice or could not understand was if you look at, have a close attention on this basalt, you see those holes. Those holes are escaping holes when the gas coming out of the rock during the volcanic eruption, a process known as degassing process. So a lot of the gases were CO2, methane, along with water vapors and others. So obviously we could not see the Miocene Columbia River basalt, but last year there was an eruption in Hawaii. It basically gave you the similar image, even though it's a smaller scale. But you see the plumes going up. So those are a lot of carbons putting in the air that we and other scientists believe that helped heat up the planet at the time, caused some of the warming time, at least for the middle Miocene. So how much of the carbon went to the air at the time? By calculation, some scientists believe there was about 5,000 gigatons of carbons was produced by the Columbia River basalt eruption. Give you a comparison of the second number, which is since the Industrial Revolution, how much carbon that human has put in the air. So it's about 1,500 gigatons. So it's about 3 times more. So the Columbia River basalt have three times more compared with the human emission. However, so that amount of carbon was spread around a 1 million years time frame, compared with now 200 years for us. So if you calculate the human induced or human produced carbon in the air, it's about 2,000 times more than the Columbia River basalt. So that shows you the power and the magnitude of carbon that we put into the air. So the Columbia River basalt or other kind of basalt flows, because they have a low silicon value, so they were floating around. So they change the landscape, they block river valleys, form different kind of land creatures. And one of this was a lake that was dammed because of the basalt flows. So that happened in the northern part of Idaho, known as the Clarkia. So the picture shows the distribution of the Columbia River basalt and the relative location of the Clarkia in Idaho. And this is a reconstruction of the lake that was due to the dam of the basalt formed behind it. So where is Clarkia? The Clarkia is a very small town in northern Idaho. If you look at this, it's a population 50. So actually less than people in our audience here. But a small town have a big name in science. So it's very, very important. So this is the fossil site. The story goes about 50 years ago, the current owner, Kenneth and Trinity, Kenneth's father, Francis, when he was opened the rocks, in preparation for a racetrack, just for the motorcycle race. And this was in a late, dark afternoon. And suddenly he saw leaves which he had never seen, because if you look at the trees, they're all evergreen needle leaves. It's big leaves floating around on the surface. So he was puzzled, and then he called University of Idaho, where Dr. Smiley was on the faculty, a well-known paleobotanist, a brilliant scientist who immediately saw the value of those actually fossils that peeled off of the sedimentary rocks. So Jack Smiley did the groundbreaking work, literally, figuratively, from the Clarkia. And I had the fortune to study under Jack. Jack was my PhD advisor and taught me actually much more than science, helped me to launch my career into climate change research. I have the honor now to carry an endowed professorship which bear his name. So once the Clarkia Lake was in place, the lake collect material both from terrestrial and also from the lake within. So those organic matters becomes fossilized, deposited in the lake. When the lake dried, now we can study the lake deposit. But you open up the rock, you will be amazed to see different colors, abundant material. They are all packed. So when I take people to Clarkia, so I guarantee, I said, everybody can get a fossil. Wow, is that possible? Look at this. So sometimes you see the fossils with a reddish or greenish colors, and sometimes it's faded in front of your eyes because of the oxidation of the material. So this is such a unique deposit. I don't think there's any other site in the world comparable with this in terms of the abundance, in terms of the fine preservation. So certainly Idaho has a lot of things to offer in addition to potatoes. So if you look at the rocks here, when you open the fossils, you'll see the leaves are big. If you look at the one on the right, it's more than a foot long for a magnolia leaf. And on the left, those are two deciduous conifers that are no longer living in the area. So where are they living now? In the modern equivalent, the Midas sequoia is living in China in a very remote valley. There's about 5,000 trees are still standing. But it's a warm, as you can see the picture, it's a warm, humid environment. And the taxodium, or both separates, they are in the southern part of the US, Georgia or Florida. Warm, humid, a lot of water. So certainly the climate have changed since the Miocene time and the modern time. So we know the larger picture, but in order to understand the fine details, the process, what caused it, what's the impact, we have to look at the so-called fine prints. So if you look at the Clarkia section here, the site is well known, and early work will focus on paleobotanical analysis, which provide a huge, large important of data. There's about 100, 500 species being described. There's also other type of fossils, insects, fish, mammal. But until last year, the precise date or precise age of this deposit was debated. So one of our work last few years was to date this particular site using the volcanic ash. So the dating turned out to be a little bit older than 15 million years. But this time, pinpointing time, is very important because it tied this deposit directly into the volcanic ash or volcanic eruption of the Columbia River basalt. So that tied into the warming with our deposit. Not only this, we're able to establish an annual resolution for the Clarkia lamination or the Clarkia fine fossil layers. So this is another way I say this is a fine print. So we're reading this rock, if you view as a book, layer by layer, one layer is 1 year. And when people think about paleoclimate data, they're thinking about ice core. So the ice core has a resolution of about 50 years between two samples. So theoretically, in our Clarkia deposit, we can work on annual resolution in a way. So for this whole site, we calculated roughly around 1,000 years' time. So this time also, the time span is also important because people dealing with a geological record usually dealing with millions of years. But now we have a fine deposit with such abundant fossil, fine resolution. We can look at this within the change of 1,000 years. So that certainly put into human time. So that is also important for the future. So if you see the Clarkia fossils, when you open it, sometimes I wonder, are these fossils? Or they are last year's deposit? Because using a simple chemical, you can lift the tissues off, you can study the fine details, provide information about paleobotany, physiology, all kind of data. Not only that, so sometimes the fossil itself just peeled out by itself. So this is why when Francis was working on the site, he saw the leaves floating around because of those cuticle tissues. So by looking at this, certainly you can analyze the fine details, the cellular material, or what's in the cell. A lot of these organelles are being preserved within the cell. So not only this, but also we could extract whole sort of biomolecules from those tissue. That bears biological climatic information. And also we can get biomolecules from the sediments as well. They are coming from a different source. For example, this GDGT is a prokaryotic membrane lipids, which we use this for temperature reconstruction. So all kind of technology we can apply that normally would not be applied to geological material. So one of the examples or early trial of this was application of the PCR, or known as the polymerase chain reaction. Now through COVID, you'll get a PCR test, same technology. So when the PCR was invented 20 years ago, this was first applied for fossils in this particular site. So far, there's 3 independent reports getting DNA from different fossils and different gene sequences. So although those very old DNA are controversial because it has a low reproducibility, but there's nobody disputing the fine preservation of this particular fossil site, which is utilized for a different kind of climate change research. One of the approaches we're using is using the isotope analysis. So as we know, that isotope incorporate environmental information, for example, carbon tracing back to the atmosphere, CO2, and hydrogen can go back to the precipitation. Once they are incorporated into biological material, so basically they stay there through a long time. So that's why they're called stable isotope. Now, new technology allow us to measure it at the molecular level. So those are the powerful tools that we're using for our paleoclimate research. So this provide an example here. So that's how we reconstruct CO2 level back in the Miocene Clarkia time. So this is known as the Frank's model. So pay no attention to this formula, but I do want you to see the CA. The CA stands for atmospheric CO2. So we reconstruct the atmospheric CO2 using carbon isotope data as well as data from the geometry of the cellular material, as illustrated here. So our reconstruction for the Clarkia, putting the CO2 level somewhere around between 500 to 550. This reconstruction also goes along with independent study by other labs as well. So we're quite confident of this reconstruction. Now the number is very important. Remember today, 420 ppm. So to get there, 420 to 500, which double amount of CO2 in the air. Now the current rate as of today, compared to last few years, every year the CO2 increase to about 2.5 or 3 ppm. So you can calculate it by simple math, how long we're going to reach to the level if we're not doing enough to control the carbon in the air. So because we have this fine print or high resolution within 1,000 years of time, we're able to reconstruct CO2 and also reconstruct the temperature during this time frame. And we look at how temperature and CO2 are correlating and changing within this time frame under a higher CO2, which hopefully we're not getting there, but the trajectory shows that in the next few decades or so, we probably will reach to the level. So this fine resolution is important. Right now, my collaborators are doing modeling using this high resolution data. So that would help us to understand near future climate change. In addition to carbon dioxide, we're also looking at another gas, which is methane, CH4. Compared with CO2, methane was shorter lived in the atmosphere in about decades time frame, but more powerful. So one of the concern is with the warming of the planet, the more CO2 will be bubbling up from lakes and other places like permafrost in the northern part. So the Clarkia has a unique deposit, which the bottom of the lake was no oxygen, was abundant of methane. So how the methane works under a higher CO2, a warmer temperature, is one of our interests. Currently, we're working here in Dr. Pearson's lab at Harvard, trying to better understand how the methane works in the lake. And particularly since we have this fine print, high resolution, we're trying to see how, through different seasons, that the methane is going to change. Whether now the methane is going to enhance the warming or was impacted by this warming. So all this get us back to the air, to the present day. Now this is a famous hockey stick, which illustrate the temperature change in the past 2,000 years until the present time. As you see it here, before the Industrial Revolution, the temperature variations on Earth has been quite small. They were limited in 1 degree Celsius. So this long time climate stability on one way nurtures the civilization. On the other hand, I think it limited us in terms of our imagination of the future climate change. So until the past 200 years or so, obviously the temperature shooting up quite dramatically. So prediction is difficult, as here one of the Nobel Prize laureates has indicated. And also the future is not very pretty. Now this is a latest work by Jim Hansen's group out of Columbia. So unpublished data, but illustrate, I think, the urgency very well. If you see the green line here, the green color line, which is the most best fit the regular prediction, which is already pretty bad, steep. But if you look at the yellow area, which is being modeled now by their group, illustrating the accelerating changes in the next few decades. Now remember IPCC's Paris Agreement. So in order to limit the climate change to have a comfortable life on Earth, we need to limit the temperature change within 1.5 degrees, or ideally. So according to this prediction, 1.5 is going to be reached in just next few years. And also 2.0, which also another milestone and probably going to be reached in about before 2040. The reason is because there's already so much CO2 in the air, the so-called global warming in the pipeline. I think that is the huge challenge that we are facing. One of the concerns, obviously, is we're reaching to a climate tipping point. So I took this picture, I put my one of the eggs on the table very carefully because I do not want to tip it because the consequences is pretty predictable. But the climate tipping point is a time or threshold when the temperature reached to the level, small changes is going to trigger a huge consequences and perhaps irreversible. And that is one of the concerns for the climate system. So according to the latest study, which published last year in the Journal of Science, so some of the low threshold tipping points, for example, the glaciers, some glaciers in the Antarctic and the Greenland ice cap, or low latitude corals. So those tipping points are being crossed as we speak. So I'm always thinking that how do we imagine the future, the climate change, if we do have several of this tipping point getting crossed? Those are the stars shows, those are the low threshold tipping points. So when I traveled between US and China, and obviously you fly over the polar route, I took this picture, and I always wondered what's underneath those polar ice cap, and once the ice getting removed, what is going to happen with the climate, and also what is the image look like? And in fact, in the past few years, due to global warming, some of the ice were melted and exposed fossils underneath. So if we look at carefully on those fossils, those are Metasequoia fossils that we mentioned earlier. So a reconstruction of the warm Arctic would look like this, a massive Metasequoia forest living in the polar area. I'm not saying that we're getting there anytime soon, but one thing we do know is the vegetation has already started to move north in a rate and speed that is quite alarming. And remember the Kharkiv fossils deposit we discovered. So those trees are living in Georgia and Florida. So they are moving north. But how about the vegetation in modern-day Idaho? They are moved even farther down to the north. So that is a reality we are facing, and certainly the future world will be a much warmer world. So if we looking at the near future with this rate of acceleration, carbon input in the air, by calculation, scientists believe that in order to have a habitable Earth, we need to limit the CO2 or getting the current CO2 extracted from the air, lower down to the level of the time about I came to the States, early 1990s, so about 60 ppm. So that is a daunting task. I'm a scientist. I see my work is to alarm the situation, but I do not want to turn off the idea that the hope lying ahead. I think it's very important for people getting together, scientists, lawyers, artists, medicine people, humanity, all the fields working together to search for a solution. Sometimes it's probably daunting or feels impossible, but this is a quote I like from Nelson Mandela. So he said, it always seems impossible until it is done. So I always ask myself what I can contribute, what I can do. I think the same question can be asked for each one of you. So I'm a scientist, I'm an educator, so obviously I will continue to work on the science trying to better understand climate change. At the same time, I have a passion working on climate change education. I feel it's so important to educate the next generation whose life will be much more impacted by climate change. So this is also part of my Radcliffe fellowship program, looking into how to transform climate change education in universities and colleges. So we have a few ideas here. Because of time, I'm not going through the details, but I hope that we can have some discussion after my talk. So I will end my talk with this slides from the Mars. So what you're looking at is an image on Mars that was a lake deposit was sediments deriving from rivers on Mars when Mars used to have water, and was formed under higher CO2 concentration. So just a couple years ago, the Land Rover landed in this area. Right now, it's moving around searching for life. So scientists says if any signs of life, it could be microscopic, possibly biomolecules or organic compounds. So what we learned from the Clarkia deposit with a very similar environment, I think put as a good analogy for the search for Mars. But also I'm intrigued by NASA's concept of dual purposes, meaning when you're looking at the space, also think about things on Earth, how to apply it on Earth. So this is a suit that my colleagues from RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, is designing for NASA for sending people to go to the Mars. But if we do not put our acts together, we probably need it on Earth in the next few years, because certain places are just simply too hot to go out. So I hope that my story can end up with the happy ending for my story, but I think we're facing a real reality here. And scientists or scientific data indicate quite clearly, the next few decades will be warmer. So the question is how warm and how fast. So when we look at the science, we need to be prepared. So anything short of that would not be science, but science fiction. Thank you. So I just also want to acknowledge the Clarkia study from the very beginning has been a teamwork. So I'd like to thank my current collaborators who work on this in the past and current time. I also want to take the time to thank my Radcliffe research fellows who are doing a fantastic job, as well as students from both Bryant and also from Harvard. And I also like to thank, the reason I'm standing here is because the Radcliffe Institute provide a wonderful stage for this kind of study, particularly for the climate change initiative that put all the collaborators from different fields together. I'd like to thank my fellow fellows who are here today and for your encouragement and also for your inspiration. Thank you.
I like these questions, actually. How do you find positivity in everyday life, knowing what could come? And how might we find positivity?
As a scientist, I'm looking at the data. Obviously, the data shows me the urgency of this issue. But I think we're living in a daily life that confronted with different aspects of negativities and issues we have to face. Living in this environment or in this time moment in a very unique history in terms of the climate situation, I think we have to remind ourselves that we need to, when facing this, we need to do our part to contribute. The climate issue is, as people said, is all hands on deck situation that everyone is being impacted, but everyone can contribute. To myself, through my daily work, I feel I'm contributing to the fight, and also I hope that through my work that more people will aware of the situation, the severity, and also motivate people to work, to find a solution for this.
Yeah. What is the state of climate change education now? And as you said, you are working on it. What can be done to improve it, especially in areas where, climate change denial is a fact?
My interest has been focused on at the higher education level, but I do know just in the past few years there was a lot of more effort in terms of climate change education at different levels in the K-12, higher education, and also in the general public. Specifically on the higher education, I have to admit that the fast change of climate caught the higher education off guard, and the higher education is not well prepared for teaching the next generation for climate change. So that requires a lot of changes. We can name a few, for example, the curriculum, and the leadership, and how university leadership view climate change. There is certainly a lot of demand from students. Now the voice is getting louder in terms of from alumni, from faculty, and just from the general public, urging the university take the leadership for climate change education. So in just last few years, I've seen more changes in terms of faculty proposing more courses for climate change, different models for how to put resources together at university levels or at different department levels to get more courses, more exposure for our students.
Let's go a little back to the Clarkia Lake. One question asked, can you please tell us more about the fine prints, the fossil records found at Clarkia?
So the word that I chose for fine prints obviously is in contrast to the traditional view of the geological data, which spans for millions of years. But I use the fine prints to say, number one, this is a high fine resolution from Clarkia because it goes down to the annual resolution, which is not very common from the geological record. The second part of that is also we're getting biomolecules and other details from the rock. Some are so fine that you have to read using instruments and other means. So those are quite unusual as well. So the combination of precise time, high resolution, and fine preservation with all the details provide us enormous data.
Right. Fascinating. We are going back to kind of climate education with these questions, and I think it's important. We know that the next few decades will be warmer, but it will also be colder. And can you explain why that is for global warming deniers? So how do you explain to someone who just doesn't believe that?
Yeah, if you look at climate change education, and it goes to also climate change communication, it is challenging sometimes to get the message across. And I think there's a number of reasons. For example, we talk about CO2, because we know by measuring the concentration, the CO2 are increasing. But as we here take the air, we do not breathe the change. We do not find the change. This is very different from pollution. Once you have air pollution, you notice right away. But the CO2 carbon in the air is hard to detect because you do not feel it. And also, the climate is a huge system where small change in one part can have a huge impact across the globe in another part, which the spatial, I think, also create a challenge. As we talk about geological time, basically, in human time, 200 years time frame, we're rewinding the tape of CO2 in the air back to 15 million years time. So that time change and also the change of the rate sometimes is hard to imagine, sometimes even for scientists. So that, I think, created room for some misconceptions and misinformation, or people trying to interpret different ways.
Right. Let's see here. What are some ways artists can contribute to the educational and outreach initiatives of, climate change scientists?
Yes. So one thing, a challenge that I'm facing is how to better visualize the near future climate change. So obviously we have to go back to the geological record. For example, we have all the data from Clarkia. We know the temperature, we know the CO2, we know what the biota look like, what the landscape look like. I would love to work with an artist trying to create some images based upon our scientific data, looking at near future. Now, if we do go to that direction, that high CO2, high temperature, what is the environment look like? By visualizing, I think that also help people to better understand the impact of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any artists in mind that you'd like to work with?
I'm working on it, so if anyone, also including the live audience or through the internet, please reach to me, so I'm looking forward.
This is another interesting question. Is there something in your childhood that prepared you for this work? Because you went to university in China, and we said that you went to, try and find more fossil fuel.
Yeah.
So how did the whole, your childhood and the studies that you've done prepared you?
Maybe a little bit. Just have some disclosure. My father was a geologist, and my mother was a chemist. So it's natural for me to work on geochemistry. But one was in the childhood. It's interesting to see this. When I was in college, our goal, or we were taught, is your geological knowledge is going to help to find more fossil fuels, more energy, is going to fuel economic development. But at the time, it's amazing that understanding of climate change, the data, the science already there, but I was not aware. I think very few was aware. If we knew, so I probably took a different path long time ago. But I always think that if our current students know what I know, what they would do. I think that also motivated me for this climate change education study.
Right, absolutely. So, and following on what you just said, we talked in the introduction about your position as inaugural Vice President for International Affairs, and this question is about your work, collaborative work across disciplines, as you try to create generative educational approaches. What are some of the challenges to multidisciplinary work? I guess we will know them in the sciences, but how about in the educational arena?
So I always enjoy interdisciplinary work, but used to be within different disciplines of sciences. So the climate situation is so different. It requires us scientists to go beyond scientific disciplines to get interactions with lawyers, with artists, with humanity, with medical people. So I do see this challenge. That's why I'm so delighted that I have this opportunity here at the Radcliffe Institute, which nurtures interdisciplinary work through interactions with our fellows. It helped me to rethink some of my approaches. In addition to communicating the result to other fellow scientists, I was thinking of what is the best way to reach people beyond scientific disciplines in other fields, and also to the general public. That again, I would hope that will go through the climate change education approaches.
Right. Let's see. So much of climate change is started up with the way supply chains are designed, as well as profit motives. How does one even begin to deal with such a problem, given how globalization works and how interconnected we are, etc.?
So as we well know from a scientific perspective, there's so much carbon in the air, and the fossil fuels was a major contribution to the carbon there. we're living in a fossil fuels-based economy. So if we look at our daily life, drive a car, we fly an airplane, we do things. So the infrastructure is built for carbon-based, so that needs to be changed. So how to do this, I think economists may have a better answers. But I do hope that people will see the source or the root of this issue. Just last few years, I've seen from different countries, and there are programs that put into places that slowly changing to our reliances on fossil fuel economy.
Right.
So hopefully this will change faster and quicker.
Right. And do you find yourself fighting fossil fuel interest in higher education? For example, do fossil fuel companies fund research and professorship too?
Personally, I do not have any experience in this, but I do hope more students getting more factual information and through their courses and through experiential learning. So that's why I think in climate change education, there was a urgent need to connect the classroom with real world. So once our students have their factual information learned, they can think through themselves. I think that's a huge improvement for the near future in terms of fighting for the climate.
Right. Let's see. So with climate change being such a pressing issue, as we have learned even more today, many audiences may wonder what I, as an individual, can do to help fight the climate crisis. So you said that you do the research, but can you make a few suggestions for?
Yeah, well, the climate change impacts on everyone, everywhere. If you think your life, what do you do, is always, there's some connections to climate change. I would always recommend people think about your expertise, what you can contribute in a unique way to the situation. I'm pretty sure there's plenty of it if you think about it.
Yeah, and so we talked earlier about the logistics and the the logistic of transporting all the goods that we use. And what kind of, of course we can't go back to, the 1800s or even before. What kind of sacrifices do you think we'll need to make as a societal level to curb climate change? What is possible?
Yeah, to moving forward, I foresee there's a time the changes would cause some inconvenience for our lives. I think that's necessary. There's ways to do it. Last couple of days, I spent my time in Washington, D.C., giving a talk at the AIEA conference. It's for a group of American international educators. One of the discussions was because we send students going abroad, overseas, they all fly around, so that certainly generate huge carbon footprints. Some of the educators, some schools already start to think, now how do we offset this carbon footprints? So approaches from building or planting more trees to other green energy project, so that the carbon footprints used for study abroad flight can be offset in other ways. So I think that's one way to think about it.
Yeah. There is we have 4 minutes. So there is a question about the metasequoia, which I would like to go back to. And this question says, it's an important part of your research. You mentioned it many times today. Can you tell us more about this plant and why is it so important? Is it because you find it in the fossil in the Calacchia Lake, or are there other reasons?
So metasequoia is very close to my heart because not only myself are interested in huge applications in paleobotany and geology. So the story was before World War II, and paleobotanists have described this kind of fossil around the world, but named in a different species. In early 1940, I think 1941, a Japanese paleobotanist named Miki, so he discovered fossils in Japan and named a new species. It was published in scientific literature, but because of the war, it was not well read in the literature. So a few years later, some Chinese scientists working in remote valleys, they discovered huge and strange-looking trees. So they collect some samples, and one of the samples were sent to UC Berkeley to a professor named Ralph W. Cheney, and other samples sent to Harvard, actually here at Arnold Arboretum. So those scientists immediately recognized this actually was the fossil material that has been described, known as the Metasequoia, because people, even during the war, kept in touch, US and Japan scientists. So this revelation was important because you discovered, it's like discover a dinosaur still living some remote valleys. So because at the time China was during the Civil War, there was a fear that because the war could wipe out the remaining species. There was less than 5,000 there. So the scientists both from Berkeley and also from Harvard helps to send funds and some travel there to collect seeds. So eventually, there was 1 kilogram of seeds were sent to Harvard to the Arnold Arboretum, and the director Merrill redistributed those seeds to different universities in the U.S., botanical gardens. So those trees are now almost 70 more years old. So we're able also to study those trees because they came from one bag of seeds but planted into different climate environment. So this is a great experiment that we're utilizing those seeds. So discovery of the Metasequoia, not only a scientific important contribution, but also illustrates the collaborations among scientists from different countries.
Yeah, and I absolutely love to end on an example of collaboration among scientists. It's just delightful.
Yeah, otherwise it won't happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Hong. Thank you for your presentation and for answering all our questions. I also want to thank our audience here in the room with me and online for your questions and attention to the talk. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find them online at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.